She was asked to step aside so the cleaning cart could pass, even though she was dressed better than half the guests in the room. A staff member mistook her $20 bill for a voucher. A volunteer laughed quietly after telling her the digital kiosk was down, then watched it work fine for the man behind her. No raised voices, no slurs, just doors that didn't open and eyes that didn't see. This story unfolds inside one of the most prestigious museums in the country, where polished floors, marble halls, and curated civility mask something colder. She never shouted. She didn't need to, because the moment the system displayed her face, the entire building froze. But you don't know who she is yet. And that's exactly the problem. If you believe stories like this need to be told, hit like, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Let me know which part of this hit hardest. This isn't just about one woman. It's about how power moves when no one thinks you have any. The Rothstein Museum welcomed the morning crowd beneath its marble archway, with its usual grandeur. Families pushed strollers across the wide plaza. Tourists snapped pictures of the colossal lion statues guarding the main entrance, and docents stood by the doors rehearsing their scripts. Among the movement stood Madison Price, poised and composed. Her shoes were polished, not flashy, and her expression held the quiet awareness of someone used to reading a room before entering. Clutched in her hand was a maroon envelope embossed with a gold seal, a VIP pass granted to very few. As she approached the entrance, blending seamlessly into the stream of visitors, a staff member suddenly stepped into her path. Tracy Collins, a senior floor guide known for her curt efficiency, barely glanced up before gesturing it. Without explanation, she directed her toward the far edge of the entry hall to make way for a maintenance cart being wheeled in from behind. Madison complied without resistance. Once inside, Madison made her way to the reception, where a handful of VIP guests were being personally escorted to the museum's new East Wing. She was not greeted. No one asked her name. A young intern walked right past her to shake hands with an older white couple behind her. Madison didn't push forward. She simply watched, waited, absorbed. Eventually, she turned and wandered alone toward the Renaissance Gallery, one of the museum's oldest and most celebrated spaces. The lighting grew warmer as she stepped into the room filled with tapestries and oil paintings that stretched across centuries of war and worship. As she approached a newly installed Botticelli, she paused in silence, letting the painted angels hold her gaze. Behind her, footsteps approached. A man wearing a staff lanyard and carrying a tablet tapped lightly on her shoulder. He asked her to leave the gallery temporarily. According to him, this section was under scheduled preservation work. Madison looked around. None of the signs indicated closure. A group of teenage students giggled near the window display. An elderly woman stood beside a bronze statue reading the exhibit notes. No one else was being asked to leave. Madison didn't argue. She nodded once and walked back through the arched doorway, her expression still. Outside the gallery, the hall buzzed softly with ambient music and distant laughter. As Madison continued walking, she passed several staff members who either looked through her or past her. At the cafe kiosk, Verisa skipped her in line to serve the next person, then offered an apology only after being corrected. In the gift shop, a security officer trailed her for 3 minutes before quietly stepping away when she picked up a catalog and headed for checkout. The pattern was never loud, never official, but unmistakable. She moved through a space designed to celebrate heritage, yet found herself repeatedly nudged to its edge. By the afternoon, she had visited 3 major exhibits, and in each one encountered a subtle variation of the same message. Whether it was being denied a tour headset without explanation, or being handed the generic brochure instead of the exclusive donor's guide, the signals were clear. She did not belong in the way others did. Not because of credentials, she had those in full. Not because of appearance, but because of something unspoken that followed her through every room. And still, she remained calm. She smiled when appropriate, stepped aside when asked, offered thanks without sarcasm. Her silence was not surrender, it was calculation. A school group arrived from the side entrance, guided by a young educator wearing a bright lanyard and an enthusiastic voice. As they passed Madison, 2 boys whispered to one another, motioning toward her discreetly. One murmured something that made the other snicker, and then both turned their attention back to their guide. A girl in the same group leaned toward her friend and asked whether the woman standing alone was staff or just someone who wandered in. Madison heard it clearly. She didn't flinch. She remained where she stood, arms gently folded, eyes tracing the sweeping lines of metal and fire in the sculpture before her. Her stillness, her restraint, and her silence were all intentional. When the group moved on, Madison followed the path toward the West Wing Cafe. The smell of roasted coffee beans and warm pastries drifted out into the hallway, and the sounds of chattering tourists filled the air. She waited patiently in line behind a group of retirees, holding a small art book she had picked up earlier. When it was her turn, she stepped forward and placed her order. The cashier, a young man with bleached hair and earbuds tucked into his collar, barely looked up. He glanced at her hand as she offered cash, then squinted and asked if that was a voucher. Madison shook her head. "It's $20, she said plainly. He hesitated, tapped a button, and then asked a supervisor behind him whether cash was still accepted. The supervisor looked up, spotted Madison, and simply nodded. The pause had already done its work. The people in line behind her now watched with mild curiosity, none of them having been asked the same question. Madison took her coffee and sat near the back corner of the cafe, beneath a window that overlooked the central garden. She stirred her drink slowly, feeling the quiet distance expand around her. No one joined her table. A couple sat down nearby and then moved, deciding they preferred the other side. At the far end of the room, a group of docents laughed about something on a tablet, occasionally glancing toward her direction. Their amusement was private, coded, and inaccessible. When Madison stood to leave, she noticed her presence had left no impression, no acknowledgement, no small nods of shared space or recognition. She might have been invisible. Returning to the gallery floor, she passed a donor wall etched with hundreds of names in bronze. Her own name was not there. Not because it was absent from the history of the place, but because her kind of giving came under different conditions. She paused to read a few of the plaques. The surnames were familiar: bankers, socialites, heirs, and legacy families whose names adorned hospital wings and university halls. As she moved toward the new digital exhibit on climate and sculpture, a museum staffer trailing a tour group stepped slightly in front of her path. His clipboard brushed her shoulder, and he muttered a faint apology without slowing. Madison let it pass. She stopped by a display of kinetic sculptures powered by wind and light, the delicate machinery quietly spinning under soft gallery lights. A child pressed a button and watched the mechanism dance. The child's mother glanced at Madison and then gently pulled the child away, her eyes lingering not on the machine but on Madison's coat. The patterns repeated, small moments, too scattered to be called an incident, too consistent to be coincidence. When Madison approached the augmented reality headset station, the attendant explained that they were temporarily out of devices, only to hand one to a young white woman who arrived moments later. Madison said note, but said nothing. Her expression remained calm, her steps undiminished. She had not come for the comfort of welcome. She had come to witness how deeply exclusion could wear a smile. As the afternoon waned, she returned to the rotunda to sit and observe. A staff meeting was taking place at the center. Interns, coordinators, and volunteers gathered around a manager giving instructions. Madison sat quietly, sipping the last of her coffee, watching the formation of roles, faces, assumptions. She listened to the way people spoke when they believed they were not. Another mentioned a woman who kept appearing in restricted areas. Someone else described a guest who looked lost but too proud to ask for help. Each description vague enough to go unnamed yet pointed enough to be recognized. A tall reflective column twisted at the center, drawing viewers in with its illusion of movement. Madison paused beside it, folding her arms and studying the engineered patterns. She barely noticed a volunteer across the room, holding a tablet angled in her direction. That volunteer, under the pretense of cataloging guest traffic, tapped twice on the screen, quietly zoomed, and snapped a still of Madison's profile. A few minutes later, that image appeared on the staff's internal chat server, under a thread labeled Security Curiosities. The caption read, "Some guests take art very seriously." The photo showed Madison with her brow furrowed, studying the reflective sculpture, her expression both analytical and unreadable. Several laughing reactions followed, one of them joking, "Is she lost, or just pretending to be profound?" Unaware of the chatter, Madison moved to the next chamber, where motion-activated lights tracked her footsteps. The moment she crossed into the surveillance range, a small red dot appeared next to her profile on the internal map displayed behind the operations desk. A junior security officer seated nearby noticed the signal, hesitated, then turned to his colleague and muttered, "Just tagging her with 2 2 taps. The officer activated Level 1 passive monitor on Madison's ID tag, a setting typically reserved for individuals who had triggered alerts or complaints. But Madison had triggered nothing, except quiet discomfort among those unsure how to place her. The system now tracked her in real time, marking each gallery she entered with silent timestamps. Meanwhile, inside the sculpture room, a group of interns passed behind Madison, whispering about a mix-up involving a visitor earlier that day. One mentioned a woman walking around like she owned the place. Another laughed and asked if it was the same lady from the cafe line who paid in cash. They didn't realize they were describing the same person now standing less than 10 feet away, her focus unwavering as she examined a sculpture made from reclaimed piano parts. A small camera on the ceiling tilted slightly as if recalibrating. She felt it but said nothing. Minutes later, she approached an interactive exhibit where guests could input their names to receive personalized art recommendations. She typed her name slowly. The screen blinked, then froze. The words, "Access temporarily unavailable," flashed in red. A staffer nearby offered to reset the terminal but didn't make eye contact. Madison declined the help. She turned and walked away. On her path to the south wing, a man in a navy blazer passed by holding a clipboard, smiled at the couple behind her, then stepped in front of her line of movement. "Sorry," he said vaguely, then returned to scribbling on his sheet. The small gesture blocked her path just long enough for a school group to overtake the space. As Madison reached the glass exhibit of architectural miniatures, she stood watching a replica of the museum itself, built to scale, complete with tiny bronze doors and carved balustrades. The irony was sharp: a building within a building, a version of power encased inside a version of culture. She stood there for several minutes, feeling the weight of all the invisible gazes, real and digital, as they circled her presence without speaking. Staff members walked by without acknowledging her. 2 young women near the brochure stand glanced at her, giggled, then lowered their voices when she turned. Somewhere behind a closed door, the operations team marked another timestamp. As she moved toward the museum's central atrium again, her steps echoed under the high ceiling. Her movements had become a subject, her stillness misread as loitering, her silence mistaken for surveillance. The attention she drew was unspoken yet unmistakable. As she stepped through the glass doors, the room dimmed in response to motion, a system designed to preserve projection, clarity, and signal occupancy. But instead of the ambient hum and seamless visuals playing across the floor and walls, the space was suddenly filled with red strobes and an automated voice that calmly repeated, "This feature requires authorization. Please see a staff member for guided access." The words echoed twice before the lighting flickered back to full brightness, momentarily blinding. All eyes turned to Madison, standing near the center, as the staff at the control booth exchanged glances and scrambled to reset the interface. The screen at the front blinked with a system log, clearly listing the visitor ID of the last activation attempt. The name Madison Price flashed for less than 2 seconds. A low wave of whispers spread across the room. A woman clutching a designer tote moved her child away from the interactive wall. 2 college-aged visitors giggled under their breath while scrolling through their phones. One of them, after a few taps, seemed to find something and showed it to the other, who let out a quick snort. Madison did not turn. She stepped backward slowly, giving space to the system techs who were now manually rebooting the console. She did not explain. She did not apologize. She had done nothing but walk in. A minute later, a staff member approached her from the side, speaking quietly but firmly, noting that the room was in calibration and best reserved for scheduled groups. Madison nodded once. "I understand," she said. As she exited, a few guests followed her with their eyes, not in admiration or curiosity, but in speculation. She walked across the corridor into the adjacent wing, which housed a temporary exhibit on interpretive sculpture curated by visiting graduate fellows. Inside, a young intern named Jared was leading a tour for 15 guests. His voice, confident but untested, projected across the concrete floor as he discussed how public perception alters meaning. As Madison quietly entered, he gestured toward a controversial centerpiece made of charred wood, mirrors, and torn cloth, explaining that some viewers found the work alienating because they lacked context or cultural sensitivity. He then motioned toward Madison, without naming her, and said that sometimes guests misread installations because they bring their own limitations into the room. Several people turned to. She stood still, offering no reaction. Jared smiled politely and returned to the artwork, oblivious to what he had just suggested. No one in the group said a word. The silence that followed was heavier than any insult. It carried the weight of silent complicity, of the kind of discomfort people don't name because they fear acknowledging it would make them part of it. Madison remained for the rest of the presentation, listening with her arms folded, her gaze unwavering. When the group applauded lightly at the end, she did not clap. She walked past the exit without breaking stride. A staffer stationed nearby offered her a printed survey card, but she didn't take it. She had already begun forming her own evaluation. Back in the central atrium, a live jazz trio had started playing for the evening crowd. Donors arrived in formal attire, mingling beside the catered buffet tables. The museum was transitioning into its evening phase. Champagne, curated conversation, and the polished performance of public civility. Madison lingered near a stone column, just out of reach of the event lighting. She observed the crowd. A woman in pearls accepted an hors d'oeuvre from a tray. A man in a velvet blazer laughed too loudly at something that wasn't funny. And across the room, a large donation check was being signed, against a backdrop bearing the names of corporate sponsors. None of them saw her, or rather, they saw something else. Something that didn't match what they expected from that setting. She moved toward the exit slowly, not with the defeated steps of someone excluded, but with the precise measure of someone who had learned exactly what she came to learn. Everything had been offered without confrontation, without shouting, without rejection. Madison's footsteps were quiet on the polished floor as she approached a large wall-mounted display designed to deliver personalized content through facial recognition. This technology, featured prominently during the museum's press launch, had been praised for its inclusivity, claiming it could greet guests in over 30 languages based on real-time demographics. Madison stood before the screen and waited. A soft chime signaled the activation sensor. Then the screen paused, blinked twice, and returned to its standby animation. A nearby visitor stepped forward after her and was immediately welcomed in Italian, with a curated itinerary and artist highlights. Madison tried again. Nothing. The display briefly flickered, then displayed a generic message reading, "System unavailable." A dictionary. Madison stepped away. She had seen enough. She moved toward the digital sculpture gallery, which allowed guests to scan QR codes and receive downloadable high-resolution files. As she pulled out her phone and raised it toward the label beside a marble structure, a woman in a navy blazer approached from behind, voicing calm but firm. "I'm sorry. We tried to limit photography in this section," she said. Madison turned, phone still in hand, and gestured silently toward the printed sign beside the sculpture. "Photography permitted for personal use only." The woman hesitated. "There are concerns about distribution," she added vaguely, then walked away before waiting for a reply. Minutes later, Madison watched a group of men scan the same code, laughing as they shared screenshots. No one stopped them. No one looked concerned. At the next exhibit, a minimalist installation of brass rods and reflective panels. Madison leaned in slightly to read the artist's inscription. A camera flashed nearby. Not hers. A couple had taken a selfie, standing beside the piece. A docent passed by and complimented them on their composition. Madison took a single photo of the inscription and moved on, aware that her presence had been noted again, this time by a PR assistant who pretended to straighten a brochure stand as he eyed her phone. These moments accumulated like sediment in her consciousness, not violent, not loud, not public, but dense, layered, and deliberate. She passed a kiosk offering digital surveys. The touchscreen glitched as she tapped through, freezing once she selected her demographic information. An intern watching from behind the desk walked over and reset it without a word, then handed her a paper version instead. Madison filled out the top line, then folded it and placed it back on the counter, unfinished. Her silence was never the absence of resistance. It was a posture honed over time, sharpened by experience. As she returned to the sculpture atrium, the live jazz had ended, and the air was thick with conversations about donations, upcoming auctions, and new grant cycles. Madison passed a group of trustees laughing over glasses of champagne. One of them, a woman with pearl earrings and an unmistakable accent, whether the words were kind or cutting didn't matter. The performance of acknowledgement without inclusion had the same effect. She paused near a staircase leading to the upper balcony, a place often overlooked by casual visitors. From there, the entire floor below unfolded like a theater. She could see the docents guiding conversations, the security guards monitoring angles, the administrators mingling with ease. She had circled his name with interest, intending to visit the gallery where he was scheduled to sign prints and speak with attendees. As she passed the cafe, now transformed into a lounge, a staff member in a sleek blazer stood nearby, engaging a small group of guests in conversation about future donor opportunities. Madison approached with composure, waited until the group dispersed, and calmly voiced her observation about the digital kiosk failure, the facial recognition malfunction, and the conflicting signage on photography restrictions. The manager, smiling politely but without warmth, gestured toward a wooden box set up near the map stand, and replied with a rehearsed tone that feedback was always welcome through written form, as it helped them continuously improve guest experience. She looked at the box. It was labeled Visitor Suggestions and Concerns, and already filled halfway with handwritten cards. The implication was clear. Her voice would be flattened, anonymized, and stored in a space no one promised to read. She thanked him anyway, folded the program tighter in her hand, and turned away. At the edge of the event wing, a small line had formed outside the gallery, where the featured painter was hosting a book signing. Madison stepped into the line, patient and silent, waiting her turn. The walls around her displayed his works, classical compositions painted with disruptive brushstrokes, a fusion of old-world portraiture and contemporary tension. When she reached the front, she held out a copy of the artist's exhibition print she had purchased from the gift shop earlier that day. The artist looked up, met her gaze, then paused. Without asking her name, he glanced down at the print and asked where she had gotten it. She pointed toward the museum store. The volunteer assisting him offered a clipped apology and added that the artist preferred to keep things organized. Madison stepped aside, her print unsigned, her presence disregarded. Behind her, the next guest, a younger man dressed casually, offered the same type of print and received a signature with a warm smile. The moment was small, almost forgettable, but deeply clear. She exited the gallery without comment, returning to the museum's rear courtyard, where the chatter of the crowd gave way to cooler air and ambient lighting. She sat on a bench beneath a bronze canopy designed by an indigenous sculptor. Above her, glass tiles refracted the colors of the surrounding stone, sending shards of green and gold light onto the ground. No one else occupied the space. From this quiet vantage point, the noise of the museum softened to muffled echoes, a closed world operating behind layers of exclusion. Madison let the silence settle. Somewhere nearby, a staff member gave directions to a couple searching for the donor terrace. Laughter rippled from a distance. Her phone buzzed with a news alert, something about local elections and funding initiatives for the arts. She glanced at it, then slid the phone away. Her mind replayed the last 6 hours in fragments, every corridor, every device, every denied gesture cloaked in professionalism, every request rerouted toward silence. She remembered the child in the student tour who asked if she was staff, the tablet that froze, the headset unavailable, the security dot blinking quietly behind walls. It wasn't confusion, it was architecture, not bricks or steel, but of policy, training, perception. She knew because she had funded institutions before. She had designed accessibility protocols for other museums, and now in this one, the one she had quietly helped bring to life, her presence was seen as a problem to be managed, not a voice to be heard. A performance was taking place in the central rotunda, where a children's choir stood in uniform beneath a banner reading, "Voices of the Future." Parents, staff, and guests had gathered in soft clusters around the circular balcony above, looking down fondly as the young voices carried upward into the high domed ceiling. Madison stood off to the side, leaning gently against a column, her eyes not on the choir, but on the crowd. Among the choir members, a young black boy named Caleb stood confidently in the front row. He had a bright voice and a louder curiosity, and as the song ended and applause erupted, his attention shifted upward. He squinted toward the second level, searching for a familiar face. When he saw Madison, he froze, then lit up with recognition. He turned quickly to his father, who stood beside a museum administrator. "Daddy." "That's her," he said. "That's the woman from your office, the one in the photo." The administrator raised an eyebrow. Caleb continued without hesitation, pointing directly at Madison. "She's the one in your big frame, the one who gave the school money for the library project." Silence passed between the adults. Caleb's father, Director Langston Abetu, followed his son's gesture and looked up. His face shifted instantly from confusion to realization, then alarm. He stepped away from the administrator and whispered something into a radio clipped to his jacket. Within moments, a wave of motion passed through the senior staff nearby. One by one, heads turned discreetly toward Madison's direction. The museum's AI-integrated display system, which had been running a silent slideshow of donor logos and mission statements on the large central wall, suddenly paused. A new sequence began. A high-resolution photo of the museum's groundbreaking ceremony filled the screen. Standing in the center of the group was a woman in a navy dress, holding a ceremonial shovel. Her name appeared beneath Price, founding patron Mothstein, Education Initiative. A murmur moved across the atrium like wind through leaves. Guests turned toward the screen, then toward the mezzanine, then back again. Staff members scrambled to adjust, but the automated system continued the display. Madison's name appeared again, in a quote pulled from the inaugural donor statement. "We do not invest in walls, we invest in what happens between them." Her face, poised and composed, stared out from the screen. With the same. No one approached her yet, but everything changed in the space of those few seconds. Conversations paused. A donor couple moved away from the exhibit they had been admiring. One of the docents, who had ignored Madison earlier, now stood frozen beside the concierge desk. From behind the ticketing counter, a young volunteer leaned to another and whispered, "Is that really her?" Madison remained motionless. She did not step forward, did not raise her voice, did not acknowledge the shift. She let the recognition settle like a dropped stone in still water, watching the ripples form and spread. A museum technician behind the main console tried to override the slideshow, but the programmed protocol had already locked in the presentation. The AI had done what no human dared. It had told the truth. In another wing, two curators abandoned their conversation and hurried toward the command desk. Dr. Langston made his way through the crowd and approached the base of the stairs, looking up with a mixture of apology and awe. He did not call out to Madison. He simply stood still, eyes raised, waiting for her to move. The anchor stood beside a marble column in the East Wing, speaking about the transformative donations that had saved the museum from closure 6 years prior. Just as the camera panned to capture the crowd and atmosphere, it caught the central screen mid-transition, freezing briefly on Madison's photo, and the bold caption beneath, "Primary benefactor of Rothstein's $800 million, 0 cents revival fund." In a matter of seconds, the still frame began circulating online, amplified by the broadcast's visibility. Viewers paused. A few typed questions into the chat. "Isn't that the woman who was denied entry to the digital room earlier today?" Others recognized the name from previous philanthropic campaigns involving city libraries and school funding. The museum's media manager received the alert seconds later. Her phone buzzed rapidly as tags, mentions, and clipped screen recordings filled her feed. She stared at the name on the broadcast and the face she herself had passed earlier without acknowledgement. With growing tension, she made her way toward the west stairwell just as the evening's keynote guests began arriving. At the same time, the museum's highest-ranking officials were gathering behind closed doors in the administrative suite. Among them was the chairman of the board, Henry Solis, a figure rarely seen at operational events, who had arrived unannounced in response to a flagged incident marked urgent by the educational director himself. The issue, initially described as a reputational emergency, now expanded into a full-blown identity crisis for the institution. Henry Solis stepped onto the main floor with swift purpose, his assistant a step behind him. He passed staff without pause, ignoring greetings, bypassing small pleasantries. His eyes locked onto the central screen just as it replayed the founding ceremony and featured Madison's historic endowment. He did not need an explanation. The silence surrounding her presence, the whispers, the administrative panic, they told him everything. Madison noticed him only as the movement around her shifted. Several staff members stepped back. One curator quickly lowered her gaze. A volunteer removed his name badge and disappeared into the guest crowd. Madison remained exactly where she had stood, beside the column, slightly elevated from the floor. as if intentionally positioned above the tides of apology now forming below her. From the live feed, online viewers watched as a museum executive approached Madison, but did not interrupt. The camera angle shifted, and though the audio muted, her posture spoke volumes. Calm, rooted, unyielding. The chat stream buzzed with commentary. A local journalist tweeted a side-by-side, image one from that afternoon, where Madison stood alone in the digital exhibit, and the other of her face on the central donor screen. The caption read, "From overlooked to irreplaceable, in the space of one breath." The tweet went viral within 30 minutes. Meanwhile, guests inside the museum began recalibrating their behavior. A woman who had previously repositioned herself to avoid standing next to Madison now moved closer, pretending to look at an adjacent sculpture. One of the junior curators offered to refill her drink. Someone else apologized for the confusion earlier with the headset, calling it a technical glitch. Madison responded with silence. Her power had never been in needing to be heard. It had always been in how people heard themselves after realizing they had ignored her. Henry Solis remained across the atrium, speaking with his assistant in low tones. When the media approached him for a comment, he simply stated that a full statement would be issued soon, and that the museum valued every patron, especially those who made its very existence possible. He never mentioned Madison's name directly, but the weight of his presence was undeniable. He had not come for the ceremony. He had come for damage control. The fallout began before sunrise. The Department of Cultural Integrity, a federal advisory body that monitored ethical practices in institutions receiving public grants, announced an immediate review into Rothstein's recent activities. Their preliminary report cited credible allegations of racially biased treatment toward a primary funder and systemic exclusion by staff. The advisory board issued a temporary freeze on all incoming government funding to the museum pending a full audit. Local government officials, already under scrutiny for their own affiliations with elite cultural institutions, were forced to issue statements distancing themselves from the museum's internal practices. The mayor's office declined comment but quietly postponed an upcoming luncheon that was scheduled to take place at Rothstein's reception hall. Simultaneously, the city's public school district made its own move. 5 elementary and middle schools canceled their field trips to the museum, citing psychological safety concerns and the need to protect students of color from institutions that failed to demonstrate inclusive behavior. The school superintendent released a memo stating that cultural education must not come at the expense of dignity. Other districts followed within hours. Teachers posted screenshots of articles alongside student reflections, expressing concern over how the museum modeled behavior to impressionable minds. The museum's financial office began receiving withdrawal notices from donors who had previously pledged matching funds for upcoming renovations. At least 2 corporate sponsors requested a full refund of their most recent contributions, with formal letters citing misalignment with values of equity and respect. In the space of one business day, the Rothstein Museum faced an estimated $4,200,000, 0 cents, in immediate losses, and projected nearly $9 million, 0 cents, in deferred revenue due to suspended contracts. Behind the scenes, administrators scrambled to contain the narrative, but every attempt at response appeared too little too late. The staff memo issued by the museum director, intended as an apology, failed to mention Madison by name and instead referred vaguely to a regrettable misunderstanding. The cashlash only intensified. A screenshot of the memo leaked on social media with the caption, "Still can't say her name." Inside the museum, the environment had turned tense and silent. Visitors walked through the galleries with lowered voices, their gazes flickering between the artwork and the staff, who now avoided standing too long in public view. Security guards stood in corners, not for protection, but as reminders of the previous day's exposure. Madison did not return that morning, but her absence spoke louder than any speech. Several staff members were placed on immediate administrative leave, including the gallery coordinator, who had denied her access to the 3D exhibit, and the intern who had used her as a live example of artistic ignorance. Tracy Collins, the floor supervisor who first diverted her at the entrance, received a formal notice of investigation. Her file, previously unblemished, now included multiple complaints from past guests, newly uncovered and tied together under the microscope of scandal. Eleanor, the PR assistant who had interfered with photography, deleted her public profiles and requested to be reassigned. Anonymous tip lines set up by local journalists were flooded with messages from former interns and volunteers recounting similar experiences of coded bias, gatekeeping, and silencing. Meanwhile, Madison's name continued to trend nationally. University art departments and civil rights organizations issued open letters of support, praising her composure and highlighting the incident as a teaching moment for future museum professionals. One professor described it as a masterclass in grace under erasure. The story reached international outlets. A cultural columnist in London called it an American reckoning draped in elegance and irony. A museum in Berlin published a solidarity post featuring Madison's quote on their digital facade. Weeks passed. The museum remained open, but something fundamental had changed. There were fewer visitors, more pauses in conversation, and a persistent quiet that lingered between exhibits. The staff moved differently, less hurried, more observant. Signs of self-examination hung not just on walls but in the air itself. Rothstein was still beautiful, but no longer unaware. Outside, the administrative wing, posters announced the launch of a new logo in December, a museum-wide equity program, developed in partnership with the same woman whose silent walk had ruptured the illusion of fairness. At the core of the program was a mandatory training in cultural humility and structural awareness, funded entirely by a private endowment, known since with the M.A. Price Foundation. The staff had no choice but to reckon with it, not through punishment but reflection. The first to enroll was Eleanor, the former PR assistant who had once tried to prevent Madison from photographing an exhibit. Her application essay read, "I've memorized policies all my life, but I never questioned who they were designed to protect." In a small side office on the second floor, Tracy Collins waited with a folded letter in her lap. She had asked for a meeting with Madison, not through formal scheduling channels but by quietly approaching Dr. Langston and saying, "I don't want a statement, I want a conversation." When Madison arrived, Tracy stood before she was addressed. Her voice cracked, though no tears came. She admitted what she hadn't said out loud until then, that her decisions had been shaped by years of assumptions she never questioned. She said, "I wasn't trying to hurt you. I just didn't think you belonged." Madison listened, not with coldness but with a gaze so steady that it became a mirror. When Tracy finished, Madison placed the letter back in her hand and said only, "Then, change what you see." The words weren't condemnation. They were an opening. Later that week, the museum hosted a quiet gathering, not advertised publicly, but attended by a group of emerging artists and preservation students from underrepresented communities. Bryce, the intern who once used Madison as a careless example, now stood at the back of the room taking notes. He had reapplied to the museum through a fellowship that focused on ethical curation. His project was titled The Art of Being Wrong, and he began it by interviewing every staff member willing to speak about the incident. He started with himself. Madison did not stand on a stage that night. She sat in the audience, her name never announced. The students knew who she was. They approached her slowly, asked careful questions, and left with more than autographs. They left with an image of power that did not shout, but shaped. Outside, winter had begun its quiet arrival. The trees in the garden shed their last leaves, and a layer of frost settled onto the stone benches where Madison had once sat unnoticed. Now, that same bench bore a small bronze plaque that read, "We remember in silence what we ignored in sound." Inside, a new exhibit was under construction, one not curated by the institution, but by a team of community voices. It was titled Presence, and it began with an empty pedestal, not because they had nothing to display, but because, for once, they knew what it meant to leave space. Madison walked those halls again, not to be seen, but to ensure no one else was unseen. The walls no longer closed around her, they widened, and so did the minds that filled them. Rothstein remained a museum, but now it was also a memory, one that taught through what had once been denied. She never asked for a plaque. She never wanted a headline. What she wanted she had finally built. Not in marble or funding or titles, but in the small acts of people choosing better, one correction at a time. The end. If this story made you feel something, anger, hope, or even just curiosity, don't forget to like and subscribe for more powerful narratives like this. Which part of the story hit you the hardest? And where in the world are you watching from? Drop a comment below. I'm reading every one.